Hi, party people. Hi, EJ. Welcome on in, everybody.
Hello. I sent a smiley face in the chat and it ended up looking creepier than I expected.
There are ways to fix that. We can talk about it another time. There's like a setting in Twitch where you can like change how your emotes look. So like if I send a smiley face, it looks a little different. Oh, that's a winky face. I always do winky faces. I never do smiley faces.
Okay. Well, I need to
But
work on my Twitch chat, I guess.
that's okay. It's fine. Like a lot of people have the creepy robot face. Nobody's gonna judge you. Look, Sarah has the creepy robot face, and Sarah's is strimmer.
It's great. I love it.
Stacie is incapable of not winking at folks. Yeah, it's a problem. Perpetual flirt. What can I say? Anyway, hi everybody. Welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm Stacie the linguist.
And I'm authentically EJ.
So EJ, tell us what we got on the docket today.
So we might actually do 2 episodes today, but we wanted to start out today by talking about Stacie's research, actually. So I kind of want to maybe play the role of like talk show host and just be asking Stacie the questions and diving into her research for starters.
Yeah, and for the record, this is gonna be weird. Just like as a heads up, I am a linguist, but when it comes to my personal research, I do very weird shit that not a lot of people in linguistics do. So if you are confused or overwhelmed, or you're like, what the actual hell, Stacie, that's okay. A lot of people, even my own field, are like that. So it's completely understandable.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to try and ask questions to like clarify anything if it's confusing or if we need to like explain or define anything. Hopefully that'll help a bit.
Mm-hmm. Actually, before we dive into that, I'm going to do a quick BRB. My apologies, friends. I just heard a cat at the door. So I'm going to take care of that real fast and we will be right back. Okay. Thank you for your patience, everybody.
Was the cat okay?
She's fine. She's fine. She just likes to come in and then takes her time getting settled. And so she likes to nap on my bed sometimes.
Aww,
So
that's sweet.
we indulge her. We indulge her because she's a cutie pie.
That's sweet.
As cats do, yes. Anyway, okay. So yeah, there was your warning. My research gets weird.
Yeah, but let's go ahead and dive into it. And maybe let's start with like, could you do like a 2-minute summary the way you would explain it to like a high schooler?
Okay. All right. So I study phonetics and phonology. Phonetics and phonology is the study of speech and speech sounds and how they interact with each other in both a physical and an abstract level. So that is primarily what I do. When we're talking about speech and how it and how we like mentally represent abstract sounds, we have various ways of modeling that. And we do that with something called optimality theory. And so I work with optimality theory, and I'm also working with formal logic to basically provide a better theory to represent our conceptual and abstract picture of our speech sounds and how they interact with each other, as well as like the physical reality of how speech works. So that is bare bones what I do, if any of that makes sense.
Right. From that description, it sounds really, really broad, actually. Is there like a specific kind of speech sound or pattern that you're particularly focused in?
So that's a great question. The answer is no. So I mean, I'm kind of taking from everywhere and everything, because the thing that I'm focusing on is like theoretical, where I'm trying to work on the theory to make the theory a better theory. I don't necessarily work on a specific phenomenon, because any phenomenon should be able to work with the theory, right? So as I'm developing my work in the future, I want to be able to do experimental studies. And I would specifically like to work with Indigenous languages because I always feel like they need more representation, and use that data to then show how my theory works. So that is kind of what I want to do. So it's not necessarily specific to any one phenomenon. It's the theory itself that I'm manipulating and working with.
Right. So it sounds like you're starting with an existing theory, right?
Yes.
And then you're changing it. What is it that you find problematic or that you think needs updating about the starting point? Like what is the original theory, I guess?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about optimality theory, or as we like to call it, OT. So in OT, what happens is you have it's a part of generative linguistics. So we're trying to predict what will come out of a person's mouth, essentially. And so you have this, you have something called gen, or the generator, and gen provides you with a certain input. So it provides you with a set of sounds or a set of articulations, however you want to define the input. That varies from linguist to linguist, but it provides you with a certain input that can be defined in various ways. And then it filters itself through or constraints. And so these constraints, basically, they will change the input in certain ways, or they will keep the input the same. And then it goes to a process called eval, or evaluator. And then the evaluator looks at all the potential candidates that you have based on what came out of the constraints. And it will choose the most optimal, the best one. And then that is said to be what we produce. And for the record, there is like a bunch of work that has been done indicating that there is some sort of like underlying representation, underlying input to phonology. There is like our preconceived notions of what we want to say, and then there's what we like actually say. And so that part is very true. My issue with optimality theory is that it's too powerful. Hi, Juno. There's a doggy in the back. That's Juno, and she's most precious.
Right. One of my two dogs.
So cute. Anyway, so my theory is that optimality theory is too powerful, and we can do too much with it because the constraints are defined by language. Like we can just come up with ad hoc constraints, ad hoc being just like to serve our theory. We can come up with these ad hoc constraints that don't do anything other than enforce whatever theory we want to push. And there's no real way to like rein it in and be like, okay, we don't want to generate too much, but we don't want to generate too little. We want to get that nice sweet spot that just generates what we know to be human language and human language patterns. So ultimately, it's kind of like, figuring out which model fits the pattern best. And so what I'm trying to do in my work is say, okay, let's rethink the constraints, because the process of generating something and then evaluating it, that's good. We have like psychological evidence that that's real. Thing that we don't really have evidence of are these constraints that are supposed to like represent different phonological processes like deletion or insertion or lenition.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so I'm working on constraining the constraints using formal logic.
Right. That's fascinating. So in my head, I'm like trying to apply this to something like tangible that we say and that everyone would understand. So an example of maybe a phonological rule that comes to mind for me is that when you take words like mountain or fountain or Clinton that have this NT in the middle of the word, it happens a lot when it's like a ton at the end of the word, then in many dialects, the T will actually become a glottal stop. And that's an example of a phonological rule, because in phonetics, you're just looking at sounds kind of in isolation. But in phonology, you're taking these sounds and you're saying what happens when I put things together. How do things change when they're combined or in sequence? And so in general, when a lot of people are speaking, they'll change mountain to mountain, fountain, Bill Clinton. Like there's tons of words that this happens with. And you're saying that in this case, your input would be, those words. And then your constraint would be something like in this pattern, to becomes a glottal stop, which is that like pause. If you're not familiar with the glottal stop, I'm not sure the best way to describe it, but it is that mountain. Like it actually is a consonant technically.
It is technically a consonant. What it is your vocal folds are just kind of stopping against each other without any other articulation from your mouth.
Right. And so the constraint would be that rule of when, this becomes this. But what you're saying is that we have these sets of constraints, and that they're too powerful, and that maybe we're like applying them universally, or saying that they're always a thing when they're actually not. Did I parse that correctly?
Up until this last part, yes. So the constraints are supposed to be universal. They're supposed to apply to every language. But in making sure that they encompass every language, and like they can talk about every existing human language, there are some instances where our constraints and the way that they're compared against each other, where they may generate something that we don't see in human language, something that is completely unattested, that's not real. And likewise, it might not be able to capture something that we do see in human language. So like I said, it can be too much where, there's a possibility that in the situation of like mountain or Clinton or something, instead of putting that glottal stop in the middle where it like belongs, where it naturally articulatorily like fits, optimality theory, if done incorrectly, without any sort of like limits or inhibitions, it's possible to just replace everything with a glottal stop, and then you're not saying anything. That is like pure ease of articulation, like faithfulness, like the easiest way to say something is to say nothing, and so then everything just becomes glottal stop, and we don't want that, right? You need to be able to say something, but you have to kind of fight perception and production to get that perfect balance. We call it faithfulness and markedness in optimality theory, to find that like optimal whatever it is you say, to make it easy for you to say, easy for someone to understand, and fit within your standard language grammar of, to make sure everyone who speaks like English understands what you're saying. So the constraints are a little complicated.
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating. So you're kind of going down to the level of like, we want to describe what always applies in every language. And so like things that come to mind for me when thinking about that is like when children are learning languages, in most languages, the words for mom and dad will be something like mama, baba, papa, because no matter what language a child is learning, those are phonetically some of the easiest sounds for a child to make. And so that's something that's kind of universal across languages. You have theories like there's the theory that children will make every single sound before kind of settling in on the sounds of their specific language. So you're trying to focus on phonological theories that might be truly spanning all language like that?
Yes and no. So yes, there are like some universals like that, where, we see these patterns in like child language development and things like that. There are processes that happen like universally, like cross-linguistically, things like deletion, where a segment in a certain place will just disappear because it just needs to be gone or it's marked in some way. But it happens a little bit differently in every language. So there are like universal processes that we see, but then they are language specific. So the key with optimality theory is you have all of these constraints, and all of these constraints should be able to produce every language in the world. But what optimality theory does is it ranks them against each other. So it says this one comes before this one, comes before this one. This constraint is more important than the other one. And when you rank the constraints like that, then that pushes certain processes above others. So so for example, like in English, we're talking about mountain and Clinton becoming mountain and Clinton. In words like that, instead of like fully deleting the T, we replace it with something else, right? We replace it with a glottal stop. Whereas in another language, they might replace it with like a W, or they might delete it altogether, or they might epenthesize, they might insert like a vowel to make it sound better, right? They have like different preferences for what they want to do. So ultimately, every language is going to have its own grammar, and that grammar is that ranking of the constraints, how the constraints kind of fight against each other. But the constraints themselves need to be universal, and they need to be subject to reality, like physical reality, as well as our like mental grammar, like what we can see languages doing.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. So the thing that's coming to mind for me right now is like in historical linguistics, there's a set of patterns that languages generally follow as they evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's how we can actually reconstruct languages that have totally died out, and come to understand them, is because there are set patterns that have kind of been established.
Yeah.
Would that be kind of an application of this type of work?
There are a lot of linguists in this area that do historical linguistics, that do like language reconstruction. That is not something I do personally, but that is something that can be done, and it is easier to do because not every historical linguist is like a phonologist and vice versa, but it is easier to do when you understand some of like the constraints or some of the rules that the language follows presently that it might have also followed in the past, and how those things might have changed over time. So that is a good application of optimality theory.
Just not one you're focused on.
Just not one that I'm personally focused on. I have a lot of struggles with historical linguistics, just with my like personal perspective on it and stuff. Like it needs to be done, but I don't understand it.
Right. Yeah, I find it fascinating, for sure. It's a very interesting subject. So I want to kind of hone in on what you're doing a little bit more. Like, do you have plans to focus on any specific constraints?
So I'm not planning on focusing on specific constraints. What I'm planning on doing is just taking our primary constraints, the constraints that we all know and love, because there's like constraints that kind of broadly generalize over certain processes. Like, for example, the constraint max stands for like maximal, which means that you shouldn't delete something. And so, if you violate that constraint, then that means you're going to like undergo a deletion process. So max just says you got to keep everything the way it is. So my conceptual idea is, all right, let's look at some of these big broad ones, because you can have little bitty flavors of these constraints too, for each like language or whatever. At least that's how people like to do it right now. But what I'm saying is we can take all of these constraints and we can reduce them to a logical formula. So instead of describing what the constraint does in language, saying, all right, assign a violation for every time a segment is deleted, that would be how you phrase the max constraint. You would say something a logical formula, like for every X, there is such that X is this, you find X in the output. So something like that. So by constraining the language we use around constraints, we can kind of hone in and specify a little bit better what exactly is going on without having the amorphous, like, I can choose whatever language I want to describe this constraint, but we all know what it means. Like having it a little bit more systematic is essentially my goal, and developing that system for all constraints.
Interesting. So in some ways, you're taking the existing constraints and turning them into almost mathematical formulas.
Mm-hmm.
You're creating this machine that's like if then, which a lot of people would probably understand the constraints in that way while they're learning them, but you're trying to like hone in and define a lot of them in very specific terms that just changes how we think about them.
Yes. So, I mean, it shouldn't change how we think about them, but it should limit the amount of constraints that we have, because there's only so much you can say with a logical language. So this is where it dabbles into like some computational stuff, because we are using like formal logic stuff like lambdas and universal quantifiers and all these other fun relational things and abstract terms and stuff. So it is pretty mathematical, but by limiting that language, we're able to describe the pattern in a more succinct, in a more limited way than if we were to just describe the pattern with human language, which can describe anything, because that's how we use language. We use language to kind of describe the world around us. But if we want to understand the underlying patterns in language, it doesn't always serve us to use language to describe itself, right? It's like if you were to describe a musical piece with everything but notes, right? It seems a little counterintuitive and it seems kind of hard, right? And it's like, I don't know if you could get all of the nuance, if you could really pinpoint what's going on in music if you didn't have a notational system, right? And so currently in linguistics, at least in phonology, that notation, we don't have a specific notational system to describe some of these patterns. So that's essentially what I'm doing, is I'm building like the notational structure that you see in music, but for language.
I like that. That's a super interesting way to put it. So if you're creating this notation yourself,
oh, well, I'm definitely not. I'm building on other people's work, but I am definitely utilizing it actively and putting my own spin on it.
Right. So you're adapting this notation to more accurately reflect what these constraints are actually doing in the language.
Yes. Yeah, that's the long and short of it. And yeah, and so a lot of us, I mean, I say a lot of us, there are a handful of us linguists who are doing work like this, who are looking at the world of logic and saying, okay, this is what logic is able to describe. These are the patterns that it's able to describe. How can we kind of tailor that to fit like phonology specifically? And in my personal opinion, I think if we find the right logical language and we taper it ever so slightly, will be able to describe the patterns for both syntax and semantics and morphology. We will be able to apply it everywhere. And so that would be my dream, is if we could one day find a notational system to describe all linguistic patterns in a way that is understandable, not just to linguists, but to other people as well. Like using formal logic is something that they do in philosophy and in mathematics and maybe sometimes in psychology. And it's something that we could incorporate in like computational systems as well. So if we can understand how this works, and if we can really hone it in, it has a bunch of different applications afterwards.
Interesting. So what I'm thinking about when you say to like create or, adapt this existing notation to represent like basically all of language, when you're talking about syntax, morphology, phonology, phonetics, like you're basically trying to represent all of language. And the thing that pops into my head when you say that is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or the IPA, which I was just watching The Expanse last night, and you have the OPA and The Expanse, and so my head is like, did I say that right?
Yep, you got it.
But you have the IPA, and it's used in some dictionaries, but a lot of dictionaries actually create their own notation, even though the IPA exists and is like very capable of representing things.
Yeah.
Is there anything you plan on doing to make the notation that you're working on more generally adopted?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because it's like I said, this is a very niche area of linguistics. I can count on both of my hands. I have 10 fingers, for those who are curious. I have 10 fingers, and I can count on all 10 of my fingers the number of linguists who are working on this. We're a very niche field, and there are some people who don't really like what we're doing. As you know, as there is with any theory in any field, there's always going to be some sort of opposition, which is great. We need that opposition. That's how progress gets made. But the way that I want to approach this is a little bit different from some of my colleagues. My colleagues are really kind of honing in and focusing just on the theory and like talking about these things in abstract. What I want to do in my dissertation is make it approachable, make it seem easy by examining phenomena in certain languages. I haven't figured out which ones yet, but by taking it and showing that we can do a standard analysis with these tools, and you will get the results that you want and more, essentially. So I like in my dissertation, I should be able to take, for example, we'll just name an indigenous language because I want to work on one. We'll name like Chumash, for example. And we'll say that, okay, in Chumash, they have these certain phonological patterns. Previously, we've described them using this, but using this kind of system. But that system doesn't always capture some of the nuances that we see in Chumash. But if we use this system, we can potentially do that and maybe do it a little bit better. So that's how I want to make it a little bit more approachable. And in doing that, if I can like show other people in the field how adaptable this is, it's not just some like weird abstract thing. You don't have to like, and I'm not a logician. Like I don't like logic. I don't like math, but it's a very useful tool. And so it's like one of those things where if I can do it, you can do it, is kind of what I want to show to the world. And it might take off, it might not. It might just be my special brand of linguistics and it doesn't become popular, and that's okay, because there's a bunch of different theories and we're all just trying to figure out what the hell language does. So this is just like my little bit of contribution that I'm hoping to give to the world.
Right. So you're hoping that by laying things out very, very simply and using actual examples and proving that your, kind of notation and way of applying it works better than other ways that these constraints have previously been applied, that then people will see that and just naturally adopt it in a way.
Yeah, that's essentially what I would like to do. And when it comes to deep theory changes, that's how you have to do it in linguistics. I mean, I could write a purely theoretical dissertation, but that's not going to be as substantial as if I were to make theoretical claims, get experimental data, and do some language documentation along the way, right? Like if I can show that my theory holds while also providing other forms of like support for the linguistic community by doing experiments and by doing doing language documentation and for like underrepresented languages, that also builds up the community. And so when people look at my work, if they're looking at like an underdocumented, like an underrepresented language, and they see that I use this notation, they're like, oh my God, like that's really cool. Like I can do that too, sort of a thing. So by like not just making theoretical claims, I'm making my point a little bit stronger because I'm like showing that my work is useful in other ways, not just theoretical.
Yeah, I actually really, really love that. I think, it happens a lot in scientific fields where you get this almost deliberate obfuscation or like complication and almost trying to hide the facts and the research behind this really, complicated language and vocabulary. And I think it's really helpful to actually tear that away a little bit and be able to simplify what you're saying so that it is approachable, so it's easy to use. And I think providing patterns and actually using real languages as you do that would definitely help there. Mm-hmm. So another question that I have, I mean, this is obviously a really large project.
It is. And it, like I said, I know it's complicated and we're just barely scratching the surface of what my work entails. But so I understand if there are a lot of questions remaining.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the questions I have is, where are you in the process right now?
Yeah. So where I'm at right now is I have a logical language I want to use. There's a beautiful diagram that some of my colleagues have built that shows different layers of formal logic and how those kind of overlap with what we know about like phonology and what optimality theory is capable of generating and stuff. And so we know like generally where we want which like logical language we want to use. Now we have to apply it to things. So, for example, in my phonology paper that I'm in a phonology class. And so we're going to write a final paper. And as a part of my paper, I'm going to be looking at a phenomenon called sour grapes stress. And I won't go into that too much because it's a little weird and we could spend a whole day about sour grapes stress. But it's just a pattern of how you stress syllables and how certain languages stress syllables. And it's very systematic. And so someone previously, one of my colleagues, has done an analysis using a logical language to describe the sour grapes pattern. But they make some theoretical assumptions that maybe we don't need. If anyone knows about foot structure, they use foot structure to talk about sour grape stress. We won't go into all of that, but there is another theory that says that we don't need foot structure to talk about stress patterns. And so my goal is to say, okay, we can use formal logic and we can use this idea of foot-free structure to describe this pattern, which minimizes the number of constraints you have, thus simplifying the pattern even further. So right now, my goal is to show that we can simplify. And we don't need, right now we have like hundreds, almost thousands of different constraints that you can apply because we've just come up with them. But my goal is to just show that we can do things in a simpler way using formal logic. So right now I'm taking this and I'm slowly applying it to different processes. And once I get my advisor, which should be next week, then I can talk to him a little bit more about some experiments that I can do and languages I can look at to expand this beyond just like small little theoretical problems.
Interesting. So one thing that came up when I was like writing my master's thesis was, what do you foresee being the arguments against your work? Like, what do you see as the biggest one or two arguments that, people will make against your theory, and how would you address those?
Yeah. So I've talked to my potential advisor a little bit about this already because I used this type of modeling in my master's thesis. But when I was using it in my master's thesis, I was using it in a very descriptive way. So it wasn't trying to predict anything about the language. It was just describing what was going on, which is fine. And logic does that very, very well. But linguists who are interested in generative grammars, who want to be able to predict language, and people who, are developing like AI and stuff, they're interested in this too, because if we want tech to be able to replicate human language, we have to, be able to understand it and put the right inputs in and everything. And so it needs to be able to function in a generative way. So by taking this logic and putting it into optimality theory, it should be able to do that. And another thing that my potential advisor has told me about is why change what we already have? Like, do we really need formal logic? Do we really need like another notational system? And my answer is yes. Because the notational system does things that human language can't, in that it restricts things. And we do need certain restrictions when we're talking about like constraints. So those are like the biggest arguments thus far, is that it's too descriptive, and it's just, it's not traditional. Like, why do we need to change things up? But I think there are plenty of arguments suggesting that, changing things up isn't so bad.
Definitely. I need to let my dog in real quick. I'll be right
back. No problem. No problem.
Okay. My dog is back inside.
No precious Michael. I love him.
Yeah. He's in the other room, but
he's a good boy.
He wanted, and he likes to just sit on our deck in the morning.
Oh, and watch the sunrise.
Yeah.
What a romantic boy.
Yeah. I think he mostly just likes that it's cold out there because he's happy, but yeah, it's fun. It's fun. Cool. Those are some really, really interesting points. I guess, is there anything else that you would want to highlight about your research?
I would say, the last thing I want to highlight about my research is I don't want it to just be phonological, because another thing about my research is I want to incorporate more phonetics into phonology. So phonology is considered really abstract, working with just, these floating concepts of sounds in our brain. A lot of people think it's like really perceptual. So it's just kind of what we're internalizing and how we represent those things with abstract concepts. But language has shown to be more complex. It's not just abstract, it's physical as well. And so I'm working on adapting these logical models, not only to optimality theory, but also to incorporate phonetic reality, right? Like in pure phonological theory, you can have a string of T's forever, and in some world that can be grammatical, right? But like, that's not how people are, right? We cannot conceptually have an infinite string of segments or subsegments or however you want to describe it. No, there are physical constraints on the body. There's only so much air we can hold. There's only so much like time we can speak before we have to breathe again, right? There are only so many ways we can configure our mouths into certain shapes. And so I want to be able to encode some of that physical reality, some of those physical constraints into the grammar to work with those abstract constraints to provide a better picture of language as well. So it's a big task, and it might not all be done in my dissertation, but that is my ultimate goal, is to properly represent linguistic patterns in a physical and an abstract sense.
That is super, super interesting. And that definitely does sound like an enormous task. Hopefully you're able to
take my whole career.
Right? Hopefully you're able to cut off like smaller pieces at a time to eventually get there. But yeah, that is super, super fascinating. I definitely just learned a lot about optimality theory. And I hope that I can actually read your dissertation at some point in the future as well, because that does sound fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I try my best to make this accessible, because having been like a teacher and stuff, I understand how certain linguistic concepts can get really overwhelming. And this theory is not an easy one to understand. But I am a simple person, and I like a simple theory. And so in my writing, I like to talk about things as simply as I can, trying to kind of strip away some of the like gobbledygook that a lot of people put into their writing. It was so funny. My potential advisor, he read an abstract of mine that I had written, and he said that it was too concise. And that's how you know you're maybe doing something right, is when someone's like, I think you're being a little too concise. Maybe you need to be a little bit wordy or a little more scientific. And I'm like, you don't need to. So I'm hoping that a lot of people can read my writing. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be excited to hear about it. Should we kind of end our first episode for the day there?
Yeah, but I know that this was a long episode because, like I said, EJ, my research is not super easy to comprehend sometimes, and it's okay.
Yeah,
It's a
well,
lot.
that's awesome. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Follow Stacie the Linguist on Twitch to listen to our live broadcasts, and also follow For the Love of Language on Instagram to keep in touch with us. See y'all next time.